Welcome everyone. This is Community Dialogue. I'm Faith Reeves, the Sustainability Coordinator here in Fairfield, and I'm with Brittney Tiller. Brittney, you are also a co-host or a interviewer here for the Community Dialogues. What is your session called? Conservation Conversations. I've seen a few of your sessions.
There you go. Glad you knew that one.
Could you, Brittney, just give us a little rundown on how conservation has played such a significant role in the great portion, probably a big portion of your adult life?
I feel like I'm kind of always shifting roles in the conservation world. My, passion is environmental education. And so I've been a naturalist in several different counties for about 10 or more years now. Wow. And probably 10 or 15.
Time flies.
Time flies when you're having fun. And now I've stepped back to spend more time with my family, but I just can't let go of conservation work. And so I'm on a few different committees that allow me to work in different aspects of the conservation world. So I appreciate that time that I get to spend in it.
Well, I'm really grateful that you're here to have this conversation with me and educate me on land stewardship. I'm excited to hear what we're going to uncover today. Could you set the stage for us for this discussion around land stewardship by describing what Iowa's landscape looked like historically before significant European contact?
Yeah, I think that is such an important question because it really shapes how we are looking at the land itself. Not that we're trying to revert it back to that point, but that we need to know all of the pieces of the puzzle that we're working with. So if we go back in time, pre-European contact, Iowa was predominantly prairie. I think most people know we're one of the most altered states in our nation. And Iowa has 0.1% of prairie remaining, which is a mind-blowing statistic. A short little tangent is that Pleasant Lake has part of that 0.1%. They have a remnant prairie at Pleasant Lake, which is a time capsule, and in and of itself, it's never been plowed. And so It has the actual seed bank going all the way back pre-European contact, which is amazing. So if we go back in time, predominantly prairie here in Iowa, and then as we would move toward the different waterways or low-lying areas, we'd see forest or timber there. And then there's lots of other habitats, but another one that's more common or was more common here in Iowa is the oak savanna. And that would be kind of a hybrid between the two. Prairie plants around, but oak trees that instead of being closer together as they would have been in the timbered area where they'd grow more straight up for sunlight, they were able to have these really wide reaching branches, and that's one of my favorite. We call them wolf trees because they were lone wolves out in the prairie area. And if you're hiking, my kids and I, we love to find these wolf trees, and you can see some of them still have these low-lying branches. Some of them, the sunlight has been cut off to those low branches, and all you can see now is the scars. But that is an important puzzle piece because it's telling us what the land was like 200, 300 years ago, which is quite fascinating. So that's really what Iowa, as I said, there would be other little pockets of interesting habitats, but those are the three main ones that we would have had here in Iowa.
Wow. I love those wolf trees also. So many of those bur oaks that still stand in those meadows. So fire obviously would have played a critical role in maintaining those ecosystems. Can you explain why fire is so important in Iowa's landscape and how it helps manage invasive species, or could still?
So if we're back in time, pre-European contact, fires would have been started in two main ways: naturally by lightning strikes, and then they also would have been started by Native Americans. They did prescribed burns because they could see the benefit what fire did to the different habitats. So fire really worked as a giant control mechanism. So you think of all of these plants, prairie, timber, and everything in between, that these fires would sweep across our state. In the prairie, they would be very quick to move across because there's so much fuel there. Then as they get to the oak savanna areas, they would kind of peter down a little bit. And then if you would get down to the forested areas, they're more low-lying and moist. Yeah, so the fire would slow down, but it would still move through those areas. And really what fire would do is keep everything at bay. So what that allowed to happen is oaks, hickories, and walnuts, I would say too, but primarily oaks, kind of in that order, also hickories, and every now and then walnuts. They were able to become these keystone trees. And they became the dominant trees of our area. Not to say that our other native trees wouldn't have had pockets where they would be thriving, but in general, those were our main trees. And therefore, the insect population was able to adapt and evolve with,
Co-evolve.
yes, exactly, with these different plant species, tree species. And so fire worked to, in the prairie, we had native trees like a cedar that would love all that sunlight in a prairie. Fire kept those at bay. Otherwise, it would have just been a mess of cedars out there, which cedars are a great tree in their place. But
they're a bridge.
Yes, but not out in the prairie. Prairie needs to be prairie. And so fire was able to just naturally control all of these different habitats and keep them, I always kind of say, keep them at bay, but really it just kept that cycle going, right? So fire was just an important part of the natural cycle that was occurring in these ecosystems. Post-European contact, slowly, over time, fire was removed from the landscape. And really what it did is it really broke that cycle, and there was a gap there. And when that happened, then, cedars started encroaching on the prairie, or some of the more shade-tolerant trees were able to thrive in the timber. And slowly, stress is now put into all of these different habitats as fire, and that cycle is broken.
Well, so succession comes to mind. I'm curious. It's like, with fire being removed in that moment, the normal pattern of succession, fire, I assume, was used as a management mechanism. Natural fire,
right.
Not necessarily prescribed, but there were prescribed burns going on with Native Americans.
Yeah.
And so they were managing against or toward against succession.
And I should also say, it's not like every area was burned every year.
Right.
Fire maybe happened in some areas every year, or it maybe happened once every 10 years. And so there were pockets where more shade-tolerant trees were able to grow enough that when fire came through 10 years later, they were past that susceptible age.
Yeah.
And so they were able to thrive in there. And so
Yep.
So it's not like just a clean.
The nitral cycles were definitely managing for diversity.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Okay, so when you're restoring an ecosystem, when you're looking at an ecosystem for restoration, what is the baseline you're aiming to restore to?
Yeah, very good. So I would love to answer that it's pre-European contact, but that ship has sailed. That's beyond what we can do. But what really triggers the need for a land stewardship plan, which is always the first step, is when we look at an area and we see stress and decline. So we see indicators that this is no longer a healthy ecosystem, and if we step back and do nothing, it looks fine now, but in 50, 100, 150 years, this will no longer be able to sustain itself. And so that's kind of that initial indicator. And so when we look at at an area, the goal is to return it to its healthiest state, which typically means let's get those keystone species. If it's a timber, we need a healthy oak hickory population, or maybe we're seeing, you know what, we've got really healthy walnut trees here. There's a stand at Whittam Woods. If you walk it, it is amazing. I mean, it will take your breath away. Beautiful walnut stand. And it's kind of at that point where we're gonna let time go and see what happens. But in, 10, 15, 20 years, if we're not seeing those walnuts regenerate naturally, that's cause for concern. We're not concerned now. We're more than happy to let it do what it needs to do. But there does come a point when it's like going to a community and you see only older population and we don't have a wide variety of those ages in a community. That should make community planners a little nervous, right? Same thing with us. If we're looking at a forest and we're seeing beautiful oak trees that are very old and mature, but none that are younger, that's cause for concern. And it's not the same thing as, it's just such a long-term thing. Like we're talking about trees.
A 200-year-old mother tree who doesn't have a next generation to replace her.
Exactly. And so that is what you really have to take a step back and see things in the big picture that it is. Because once you miss a window, a really important thing is preserving that genetic line. So if we look at an area and there are really beautiful mature oak trees and no younger ones, the best case scenario is to get light on the ground so those acorns from those trees that have been here,
that are well educated to the ecosystem they will be born into,
then that's the best case scenario. Now there's a lot of stressors on our oak trees naturally. And so we really want to give that genetic line the best chance it can. If enough time passes and we're not seeing that natural oak regeneration, then we typically would step in and plant oak trees. That's not our goal. That would be the second best option. And so it's interesting because you need time to see how the natural environment is going to respond. And the goal is always to be as hands-off as possible and let it do its thing, but bridging those gaps so it has the best chance to return those natural cycles.
And so the keystone species, just to when we're speaking about ecosystem health or habitat health there, those keystone species have co-evolved with their adjacent other species for centuries, millennia. And so, it's being aware that if they aren't there, then these others can't be here either.
I think one of my favorite things to do with kids is to look at leaves, which most people are like, leaves? What's interesting about that? But if you look at oak leaves, there's galls and little insect homes all over the branches and the leaves and all over them. And that's an indicator. The other thing is they're normally eaten up. Animals are devouring all of these different parts of an oak tree. That's an indicator. This is a keystone species. If we remove even one tree, think of all of the insects, just insects alone, that are no longer able to survive because this one tree is gone. And so that's where that keystone, I love trees, but not all trees are created equal when you're looking at it in terms of food chain, food pyramid. We really need to think of the ones that are going to be most beneficial for our insects, and that
thus
helps,
our birds.
That helps move it up the chain.
Great. So you've touched on the essential aspects of restoration and active management versus letting habitat recover on its own. Can you describe when, I think we have described when active management is necessary. that stepping back process. What are those indicators there? Is it just when you see those keystone species in recovery, then you step back? But what if you also see something else going on when it comes about, encroachment of opportunists?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think we did a great job of kind of painting fire, the historic picture of fire, but I kind of gapped on invasive species.
Yeah.
And so if we go back pre-European contact, like we said, we're talking about ecosystems that evolved together.
Yeah.
And
niches that were created over time.
Yes. And certainly over a long amount of time, ranges of different plants and animals shifted and changed as the climate did. There's no doubt about that. But post-European contact, what happened is people with great intent, these plants from Europe, we love them.
They're
Let's
beautiful.
bring them over. And as gardeners, I mean, sometimes there's plants that, like in my garden, I'm like, I can't keep this plant alive. And then there's others that are like, how is this one still alive? I haven't paid attention to it, right? So plants have this spectrum. And what happened is when Europeans brought some of these plants over, some of them were very well behaved.
Yeah.
And some of them weren't. And they escaped cultivation is kind of a term that's used. Mostly what happens, or a lot of times what happens is some of these plants that have delicious berries get eaten by the birds, and then they have this nice little fertilizer packet that they're planted in. And so they're spread very quickly. And so they are food for wildlife. That is true. But not a very great meal. It's like if I would give my kids M&Ms. Like it's a treat, but it's not going to sustain them. In addition, it's not, those leaves are not, and the plant itself are not feeding insects.
Yeah.
So when it comes time for mama bird to feed her baby bird with a nice squishy caterpillar, they're going to that oak tree or that hickory tree or one of our natives, right? And so, so when invasive species were introduced, so anything that's non-native, there's kind of different categories, but non-native and invasive are kind of the category. We generally just call them invasive, but I think it's better to be a little more specific and say non-native invasives. So that is a big thing that we're also looking at, and a big piece of that is that these plants don't have limiting factors like our natives do. They don't have, some people say they don't have pests eating on them. Well, they don't have insects. Pest is kind of a negative word. They're not part of this ecosystem, right? So they don't have as many things feeding on them, and they don't have diseases or fungus that are keeping them in check.
Yeah.
And so they're able to outcompete our natives in a lot of circumstances. So when these non-native invasives get into our ecosystems, they can quickly become a problem. And so that is a big thing that's normally addressed first. And I will be the first one to say, when you see invasive species removed, it is startling at best. It can be a very dramatic change. And unless you kind of see that picture of, I think sometimes we look at a stressed ecosystem and we still see the beauty of it. And that is a wonderful thing to have, right? Yeah. But in reality, it's a stressed system. And it can maybe limp along for a few more years, but we're seeing insect population decline across the world, right? But definitely here in America, I remember as a kid driving down the road and we'd stop at a gas station and my parents would clean the windshield. I don't know in my life, I think I could count on one hand how many times I've cleaned my windshield. And it was mostly because my kids wanted to see it, right? That is a problem. That's something that we should be very concerned about. And land stewardship ties so much with this that we don't have time to waste. We don't have time to let it ride out and see what will happen. We need to really begin actively pursuing what our insect population and therefore our bird population and so up the food chain, however you want to say it, we need to start protecting our insects. And it really starts with fighting for our native species.
Their food sources.
Yes, their food sources. Yes, exactly.
It's like, yes, there are so many assaults, and yes, we need to look out for those, but mostly we need to make sure they have the habitat that they have evolved to use as their food source.
Yes. And I think a lot of times we say native species and people's mind goes to animals, but really the plant life is where it all begins. If we're not managing and being good stewards of the plant life, the rest is crumbling. We just maybe don't quite see it yet.
In the restoration process, when you're going through and doing some of that more aggressive work in the beginning of resetting or making those shifts, selectively making those shifts. How are you thinking about the adjacent aquatic ecosystems?
And your question made me think of kind of one thing, and then I'll get to that question if I remember it.
Yes.
Is that aggressive initial removal of invasive species should be a one-time removal.
Yeah.
It's not something that's going to happen again in 5 years and then again in 10 years. It should be, and what we are managing it for is once that initial the initial population of invasive species are removed, then it's management. And that ideally looks like fire. And then from there, if fire is unable to control it, then additional measures will be pursued. But the hope is pre-European contact. I know we can't ever get back there, but fire was that good cycle and invasive species weren't there. If we can keep the invasive species as minimized as possible and use fire as much as possible, then we can step back and stand out of the way and watch the natural cycles do their thing. So really the initial push, it's typically a 3-year, very intense initial push. And I have had people say, why can't we stretch that out over 10 years so it isn't so dramatic? And that's a great question, typically because if you are not aggressive with an aggressive plant, like an invasive species, you end up allowing it to just kind of continue and make just a festering issue.
Depending on how it propagates, if it's below the ground, if it is a vining plant, if it is seed, bird spread.
And then also, in that same line of thinking, a lot of this work is done through grants. Which are typically
short cycle.
The short cycle, yes. So those are kind of the two reasons, but I wouldn't say it's because grants are 3 cycle. It's really because an aggressive initial approach is overall better for the land. You have equipment in once, and then you're removed. Instead of every year for 10 years, you have equipment moving in. No, you're really trying to do an initial and then step back and let it do its thing.
So having that management plan that is in effect post 3 years, that brings in that prescribed burning or brings in the management. The management process.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think, Brittney, we probably could have another round here.
Yeah, part 3, 4, and 5.
I have a lot. I mean, I was actually just trying to stick to my questions. There's a lot that I want to ask you about. So why don't we pause here and we'll do this again soon. I really appreciate you coming and sharing all of your knowledge, and I look forward to learning more from you and for the community to have more knowledge to share as we, learn to love our land stewardship processes here and continue to love the beauty that is Jefferson County.
Very good. Awesome. Thank you so much, Faith.